Welcome to the next unit where we will be implementing the delete functionality of our CRUD app. So let's go back to data, schools.go, and let's come all the way to the bottom where we have our delete. So delete will simply take in the ID of the school that is to be deleted. We will delete that record and provide an error message at the end. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is to actually check to see if the ID actually exists. And so instead of having to type that, I will just borrow that functionality from here. Okay, so let's just copy that. All right, that's the first thing we need to do. Does the ID that was passed in to me actually exist? All right. Okay. So let's get rid of that. Good. All right. All right. So it's telling me that I was trying to return two things, but I'm only supposed to return an error. All right. And so we will return error record not found. Okay. So that's if the ID doesn't exist. Now let's move on. Let's assume the ID exists. And so what we will do is to create the delete query. Okay, and so that's rather simple. So we have a variable named query, and our query is to simply say delete, okay, name of the table, schools, and then we need to specify which row in that table. So we're going to say where ID is $1. Right? A very simple query. And so now let's execute this query. Right? Again, very simple. We're going to say results. We're going to have an error. However, we're going to say exec. Okay, that's how we're going to use. We're going to use the exec method. Right? So it executes a query without returning any rows. All right? So we don't want any rows being returned. However, it does return two things: a SQL.result type and an error type. Okay? And we'll see how we use this result type in a bit. So let's pass in the query. Let's pass in the parameter, the ID. And that's all we need. So now let's do some error checking. So if error not nil, then we know we have a problem, and so we'll just return that error back. Okay, great. Now let's assume that there are no errors and we get past the error check. Then we need to actually check. Okay, so we need to check how many rows were affected by the delete operation. Okay, and to do that, we will actually use there is a method called rows affected. Right? So we call the rows affected method on the results variable. Okay, and so result allows us to do just that. So we have a variable name. Let's create a variable called rows affected. All right, and in there we'll store how many rows were affected. All right, and why do we need that? Why do we need to know how many rows are affected by the delete? Well, we're going to see that later on. And so I'm going to say result. Notice I can have result that last insert ID or result that rows affected. Okay, and so it basically tells me it returns the number of rows affected by an update, insert, or delete. Not every database or database driver may support this, so keep that in mind. Anyway, it returns a number as an int64 and an error message. Okay, so all we must pass in is nothing, right? So notice there's nothing to pass in. All right, great. So once we call that method, let's just check the error message. If error not nil, right, then we know that there is some problem, and again we will just return that error. Okay, so now assuming that there are no errors, we could actually now check to see the rows affected. And so what I want to do is to check to see if there were 0 rows affected, which means there was a problem. So let's check if no rows were affected, right? When we delete something, we expect at least one row to have been affected. If no rows are affected, deletion did not work. If rows affected is 0, right, then we will return the record not found error type. Now if all of this passes, we will simply return nil, right, to signify that our delete or deletion was successful. Right? Great. So again, very logical. Check to see if the ID passed in is actually valid. If it is valid, we construct our query, right, or delete query. We execute that delete query, of course checking for errors. And once the query has been executed, we need to check to see how many rows that query affected. And if we find out that there were no rows that the query affected, then we will simply return error record not found. Otherwise, we'll return nil to signify that the deletion was successful. Alright, so rather straightforward. So the next thing, of course, you should see the pattern by now. The next thing is, let's create a handler, because we don't have a handler right now for deletion. So let's go back to API schools and let's create a delete handler at the bottom. Okay, so right here. All right. So again, it's a method on application, and it's going to be delete school handler. Okay. Of course, by now you know a handler takes response writer and a pointer to a request object. Okay, so what's the first thing we need to do? Well, I think that would be obvious. If you think about it, we need to know which ID. Alright, so which school should we delete? And so we need to get the ID. And again, that's code we have previously written. So I'm not going to rewrite that code. I'll just copy it from here. Alright, so we get the ID from the URL to find out which school is to be deleted. Right? Great. So once we have done that, then we need to actually delete the school. All right, so let's delete the school. From the database. All right. Now, we will send a 404 not found status code, all right, to the client if there is no matching record. All right. So let's call our delete method. So app dot models dot schools dot delete. Okay, and we need to pass in the ID. All right. Again, we need to now check for the record not found error. So this is a common pattern. So again, I will not retype all of that. I will simply copy it because we have done that previously, right? So right here, you notice we are handling errors, right? And so this is the common pattern right here, right? Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to check if there's an error, right? If the error tells me that there was no record, then I'm going to say not found response. Otherwise, it's some other error, and so I will assume that it's a server error. And then I will return. Okay, so that's the common pattern that we follow. Okay, so let's now assume that we've passed that and there are no errors. Then it means that the deletion was successful as far as we are concerned. And so now we need to notify the client and tell them that the deletion was successful. And how do we do that? Well, let's return a 200 status OK to the client with a success message. Okay, so I'm going to do that, and so I'm going to call the app.writeJSON method. I'm going to pass in W, of course, and I'm going to pass in HTTP status OK. Yeah, status OK. And then I'm going to pass in the actual JSON. So envelope, and I'm going to use message. Okay. And the message will be another string. And that string will be something like school successfully deleted. Right? And the last thing we need to provide is header information. Well, that's going to be nil. Right? We're not passing in any headers. Okay, that's that. And then we simply check for errors. Right? So if error not nil, then we know something went wrong while we were trying to write the response. And so we will make that be a server error. So app.server error response. We're going to pass in W, we're going to pass in R, and we're going to pass in the error message. Okay, and that's all we need to do. Notice I don't need to say a return because we're at the end of the method, so it will return anyway. All right, so no need to explicitly put a return here. Okay, so that takes care of our delete school handler. Again, very straightforward. We get the ID, we use the ID to call the delete method. The delete method will return an error variable, right? Error type. We need to check that. If there are no errors, then we need to write to the client that the deletion was successful. All right, that's good. So that's step 2. And so now the third step, which I think you should have figured out by now, is to actually create that deletion URL. So let's go back to routes and let's register this route. Right, so we now want to be able to call this route. So let me copy this. Let me paste this, and it's gonna be method delete. Right, and the URL will simply be v1 schools :id. So notice these three URLs are essentially the same, but because they're using different methods, get, put, delete, then Go knows that it should be calling a different handler, right? And so again, that's the great thing about REST APIs. It makes your code more manageable. So this is delete school handler. Great, so everything looks okay. So the final step is to actually start up our server and do some testing. Okay, so my server is up. Let me call the delete. Okay, so to call delete, I'm going to say curl, and then I'm going to say that the method, remember, -x, capital X, is going to be delete. Okay, and so now I just provide the URL. So localhost :4000 v1 schools /1. Okay, press enter. All right, so we have a problem. Let's see. Okay, so we have an error. It says near schools, and it's telling me there might be something wrong here. All right, so delete schools where ID is 1. I don't think there's any error there. All right. Oh yeah, actually there is an error. Delete from schools. Okay, so delete from schools. Right. So PQ is telling me that it's the SQL statement. All right, let's save that. So delete from schools. Okay. Let's try again. All right, great. So I have a successful message. The deletion was completed. All right, again, notice I messed up. I screwed up my delete query. Let's run this command. Let's run this request again to see if we get the correct message. All right. So the requested resource could not be found, which makes sense, right? We deleted it. So if I say PSQL $apple tree underscore db underscore dsn, okay, and if I say select all from schools semicolon, then we have no rows. All right, so the deletion was in fact correct. Okay, so we'll leave it here. Again, I will not be removing any errors that I encountered, so you can clearly see how I resolved that last issue. All right, so let me add this. So git add, and let's have a commit message. All right, so I added the delete functionality. Okay, and let me just push this. Okay, and so we're good. All right, so in the next lesson, I want us to move on to partial updates. So remember, previously the client had to provide all the data for the school, even though they might have only wanted to change or edit only one of the fields. So I want to now show you, in the next lesson, I'll show you how we can write our code so that the client only has to provide the data that they want to edit. I'll see you in that lesson.